And in Revelation, John introduced the concept of the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, of course, the Messianic kingdom had been preached by prophets in the Old Testament, but this 1,000-year period fired the imaginations of the early Christians. Papias was one of John's disciples, and he was the first to write out his idea of what the millennium would be like. And he saw grapevines with 10,000 branches, 10,000 clusters, grapes that would provide gallons of wine. He saw wheat fields with 10,000 grains of wheat. So this is an agricultural abundance. This is also a period of time when humanity and the animal kingdom were all at peace. Isaiah, the prophet, often spoke of the Messianic kingdom in this way. As decades passed, Christians looking for a literal millennium thought that perhaps the resurrection of Jesus would be the event that would make the millennium possible. But as decades passed along the way, they began to think, well, perhaps we should look for another event that would inaugurate the millennium. And that event that they began to look for was Jesus' return. Justin Martyr was an early Christian philosopher. He is considered the first pre-millennialist, that is, one who believes that Christ's return will precede the millennium, pre-millennium. About 160, Justin affirmed that the faithful dead would rise and would reign with Christ for 1,000 years in a rebuilt Jerusalem. During the next decade, a charismatic prophet named Montanus was living in what is now known as Turkey. And Montanus claimed that he knew where the New Jerusalem would descend. There was a plain nearby that fit the measurements of New Jerusalem. It was bounded by two cities, Papusa and Timian, and he instructed his followers to come to that site and await Jesus' soon coming. Well, there were other fanatics in the same area and also in Syria that made similar claims. Their followers sold all that they had in anticipation of the coming millennium. So when these claims failed to come true, these followers in disappointment began to turn away from their faith, and many were destitute. So in response to these wild claims, Hippolytus of Rome in the early 200s actually named a date for the return of Christ, what we would see on our calendar as 496 AD. Hippolytus calculated that Jesus would return 500 years after his birth, and placing Christ's return so far in his future meant that his contemporaries would quit looking for Christ's return. It diffused their expectations, and so they then could live in peace and go about their business while they served Christ. Well, it was decades later when the great persecution broke out in 303. Many Christians saw this as the Great Tribulation, and they saw the Emperor Diocletian as the first beast. They saw his Caesar Galerius as the second beast. But 10 years later, as if by a miracle, Constantine arose as a major political figure. And then in 324, he became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. Well, he ended persecution and established Christianity as the favored religion of the Roman Empire. What a role reversal for the church. If I had been living at that time and I no longer feared persecution for my faith, I no longer feared that my wife and children might be sold into slavery, I no longer feared that my property would be burned. I no longer feared that my church would be confiscated or that my pastor would be imprisoned. I would be so delighted that I would name Constantine the man of the year. Eusebius of Caesarea, who is considered the first church historian, was ecstatic. And he said this about Constantine: "The angel of the mighty council, the great captain and leader of the armies of God, suddenly appeared." So many Christians felt that the millennium had come and that this was the era of peace and prosperity for the church that they had anticipated. They expected that Christ's second coming would occur after this millennium was complete. That is a post-millennial view, that Jesus would come after the millennium. Well, later in the 4th century, Augustine of Hippo made his mark on the church. He was the last of the great early church fathers and the first of the great medieval teachers. He taught that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 is not a future event. Instead, the millennium began with Christ's first coming. Therefore, it is the current age of the church. It is a symbolic, extended period of time in which we are now living. God's people are reigning now with Christ as promised in Revelation 20. This position is known as amillennialism. That is, there is no literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Instead, the gospel is advancing continually throughout the four corners of the earth.